Hello, this is İlhan Tanır, Senior Editor at Ahval. Today I'm joined by Michael Hanna, Senior Fellow at the Century Foundation based in New York. Michael Hanna works on issues of international security, international law, and U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and South Asia. And today we are going to discuss Turkey and Egypt relations, a view and angle from Egypt. And as an expert on Egypt, I am very much looking forward to asking you the questions, the latest developments between the two countries. Welcome to the program, Michael.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me on.
So I have been following you over a decade since the Arab Spring. Your commentaries, especially on Egypt, very insightful. And I cannot wait to ask you, what do you see right now, your sense of the current relationship between Egypt and Turkey, and whether you see you are on the side that think there is something substantial happening, or more of a makeup? What's your view?
Yeah, I think more broadly in the region, it's a period of transition. It's not just Egypt and Turkey. We obviously have a new administration here in the United States. The blockade, the Arab Gulf-led blockade against Qatar has ended. And there seems to be a kind of sorting happening in the region. The situation in Libya has evolved, and some of the kind of dividing lines have broken down somewhat, in I think a positive fashion. And there has been obviously a lot of developments, which I'm sure we're going to touch upon in terms of the Eastern Mediterranean. And the emergence of a gas forum and various kinds of demarcation. And so, we have now Turkey reaching out not just to Egypt, but the Gulf countries. And so clearly something is afoot. There have been public signals very clearly from the Turkish side. Egypt has been more reserved in terms of its response to these public Turkish overtures. But clearly there have been contacts in the background, particularly on Libya. And it is, I would say, too soon to know how far this is going to go. Is this going to produce a kind of genuine rapprochement? Or is this just, more positioning in public than an actual change in the fundamental nature of this important bilateral relationship? I would add that it's important to remember that the trade relationship has not been disrupted, right? The trade agreement that was entered into, I believe it was 2005, trade has continued to increase. There was never a full rupture of relations following the coup in 2013, which obviously Erdogan and Turkey took a very strong position on. Although clearly relations have been downgraded and have been strained. Contacts have continued. Trade has grown over time. But clearly this is not a well-functioning relationship overall.
Before moving to my follow-up question, just wanted to see if I got it right. So you think that it is still too early to say whether this might lead to something, something real? And what do you need to see to understand or believe that the things are moving significantly and seriously between the countries?
Well, I do think things are moving. We saw yesterday that there was this move by Turkey to seemingly clamp down somewhat on the nature of the Egyptian satellite channels that are opposition channels that are broadcasting from Turkey and have been a sore spot for Egypt. And it seems as if Turkey is taking initial steps to curb some of that criticism. Again, it's one of these things, it's at a very early stage. It's unclear what that will mean in practice. Is this a kind of test run? Is this really going to change the way that they broadcast? Will it really curb their criticism? What happens to these opposition groups in Turkey? Egypt has very far-reaching demands that I find hard to imagine that Turkey would fulfill, such as extraditing and deporting opposition figures to Egypt. That seems a bridge too far for Turkey, I would imagine. So, again, we are at an early stage. Clearly, there have been contacts, important ones. This latest move comes in that context. This is and has been a longstanding Egyptian demand, and it clearly has caused a lot of consternation among Egyptian opposition figures who are located in Turkey. It's a fairly substantial number. It's one of the kind of bases of international operations for Egyptian opposition groups. And they have shown real concern about what this might mean for them and their future. So, I think obviously a lot has happened very quickly. It's all spilled out into the public domain. So it would be silly to dismiss this as business as usual, because it is not. But, obviously we are in the early stage of this, these public overtures and steps. And, time will tell if this is going to be sustained and whether the steps can be reciprocal in a way that satisfy the wants of both parties.
I see. You mentioned there's new administration in Washington, D.C. Obviously, President Biden has not called Turkish President Erdogan since he got elected. And I think he has not called President El-Sisi as well. What is that this outlook, the initial cold shoulder coming from Washington to both capitals, can we count this as one of the factors or main factors for this new rapprochement?
Yeah, it's clearly a factor, I believe. And, both of these parties are going through very serious strains in their relationship with the United States. That has been accentuated by the transition from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. The Biden administration has sent a message, I think, very clearly to some of its longstanding partners and allies in the region. Its dissatisfaction with, their behavior in the region in recent years. They don't want to replicate the way in which the United States related to these countries during the Trump administration, which in many ways was a blank check for some of for some of the behaviors that I think are of most concern now to the Biden administration. And again, what does this mean in practice? Is this simply a change in rhetoric and atmospherics, or does this actually have real, tangible impact on the way in which the United States is going to relate to both of these very important traditional partners? So I think it is a factor. Both of these parties have, for a number of years, for many people in Washington, been seen as problematic actors in the region. I think both countries have an interest in changing that perception, perhaps being seen as reducing tensions in the region. And to the extent that they can do that, I think it will put them in better standing, not just with the United States, but with other, with other partners. So I think it is a factor. I don't think it is. I think it'd be a mistake to think about this as the main factor. And that goes to sort of U.S.-centric view that sees every action in the region as happening in response to the United States, and I don't think that's the case at all. But I think it is one factor among many, and both countries are perhaps emerging from a more maximalist moment in their regional policies. They seem to be reaching for a more pragmatic approach to the region. And I think some of that is a reflection of the failures of their more maximalist policies. So, again, I hate to sound like a broken record, but it's the start of something, and whether this is genuine and sustained is something that will be borne out over time.
I understand. So you were describing Turkish-Egyptian relationship, and you were explaining that how the trade between the countries continue to increase. That sounded like very much like a Turkish-Israeli relations, that the leaders could not get along, but the trade ties just continue to increase. Uh, in a scenario in which this country somehow have some kind of consensus and find ways to moving forward, what kind of a relationship would President El-Sisi, and Turkish President Erdogan would have?
Yeah, I think the relationship. It's hard for me to imagine that this grows into a fully robust and close relationship as long as these two men are leading their respective countries. And it's not just those two. I mean, Egyptian elites and Turkish elites have grown used to hostility, press coverage of each country has been quite negative in the other. And so, this changing attitudes at the elite level is something that I think will take some time, some signaling from the state itself. But I think it's hard to imagine just seeing the past 10 years of Egyptian-Turkish relations and the response of each of these individual leaders to the other country and to their counterpart. It's hard to imagine that Egypt and Turkey under these two men could grow particularly close. I think the idea of a rapprochement, the pursuit of pragmatic interests, contacts at a level. At the level of the defense ministry and the foreign ministry, those are steps one could imagine in the future. Like an Erdogan-Sisi summit seems like a step too far. I think there is a lot of bad blood, a lot of suspicion, and that that is a limit on how far the bilateral relationship can go moving forward.
So Erdogan obviously has other very bad relationships in the region with Saudi and UAE and Israel, and even with Jordan. Not much going on between the countries, but especially Riyadh and UAE. If or let me ask this way, can Egypt somehow mend its ties with Turkey, with Erdogan, while the other Gulf countries are still in a regional fight with each other? Can this happen?
So, I think each of these countries are differently situated. I think it would be wrong to view them as a kind of block in terms of their relations with Turkey. Clearly, Turkey has also thought to prioritize its overtures to Riyadh. I think UAE is a harder issue for Turkey, and they have different issues at stake because each of these countries is situated differently with respect to Turkey. Egypt has already shifted its Libya policy away from the UAE position on Libya to a much more pragmatic line that I think has reduced tensions with Turkey to an extent in recent months. Egypt's interests in Libya are quite different than the UAE, although the UAE is heavily invested. Egypt's interests are really driven by security and geography, and less so now at this precise moment from ideology and power projection, which much more defines UAE's role in Libya, historically in recent years and more recently. Egypt's position in the Eastern Mediterranean and the gas forum obviously looks different than the interests of the Gulf countries, and so you factor into that the location of Egyptian opposition figures in Turkey. All of that is to say that the interests of all of these parties are different. It is clear that particularly in the Trump years, the region really did polarize in many ways, and with the Saudi-led blockade of Qatar and the tightening of relations between Qatar and Turkey, it looked as if the region was dividing into blocks. With the end of the blockade, with the turning of politics in the United States, with the new administration, I think the region looks different and is acting differently. And I think it would be a mistake to assume that Egypt is necessarily tied to Saudi and the UAE in terms of how it will approach Turkey. And I would note just one last point here, that even in recent years, when Egypt was heavily dependent on Saudi and UAE, shouldn't be forgotten that Saudi and UAE, along with Kuwait, basically bailed out the Sisi government after the coup. They came in with $20 billion of assistance that I think really enabled the overthrow of Morsi. Egypt hasn't been subservient to the demands in terms of regional policy of either of these parties. When Saudi sought Egyptian assistance in the intervention in Yemen, Egypt rebuffed them. Egypt has taken a very independent line on Syria and has not followed the kind of ideological line pursued by Saudi in previous years. Egypt is not particularly invested in the sectarian polarization of the region. Iran is an afterthought for Egyptian regional policy. And so Egypt has really prided itself on acting independently, even of its patrons. And so I don't think that we should think that this particular issue would be any different.
Thank you. Very insightful and helpful. Let me move to a subject, Eastern Mediterranean, in which we have seen number of Turkish officials, senior officials, whether foreign minister, Turkish foreign minister, or defense minister, have been praising Egyptian behavior in the Eastern Mediterranean because of... Can you explain why the Turkish officials are so thankful to Egypt when it comes to Eastern Mediterranean?
It's a good question. I think I should ask you. I think Turkey is worried about what is happening between Egypt and Greece and Israel and Cyprus. We recently saw demarcation of the maritime boundary between Egypt and Greece. France is obviously an important player, or wanting to be an important player in the Mediterranean. Turkey has been seeking to demarcate maritime boundaries with the Libyan government. So this is a site of potential friction and tension, and I assume that Turkish moves recently seem to be wanting to turn down the temperature, and obviously there is no agreement between Egypt and Turkey on maritime demarcation. So I think there have been worrisome developments in terms of bandwagoning really against Turkey in the Eastern Mediterranean, and I think from the perspective of reducing tensions, something has got to give in terms of how Egypt and Turkey have been approaching these issues. Obviously, there are bigger issues in terms of Israel and the PA and Lebanon. This brings in all of the regional parties. I don't think the issue is ripe for a kind of grand settlement in terms of disputes and claims in the Eastern Med, and obviously tied with natural gas exploration and export. But I assume it is in keeping with this broader policy to try to reduce tensions. In some ways, I think Egyptians were caught off guard by how public these messages and overtures were, and I think Egypt has been slightly more reticent in public in terms of engaging with Turkey, and the Eastern Med is in keeping with that broader pattern.
I understand. So this Eastern Mediterranean gas forum that was established, I think, half a dozen countries, and Egypt one of those, but Turkey is not there. Turkey finds that forum obviously angering Ankara. How that forum, should we take that forum going forward seriously in terms of Eastern Mediterranean energy fights, or is this something just, some argued, I've seen that this forum just temporarily made against Ankara, but it will not have a future?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I would say surely Turkey sees this as being a raid against it, rightfully so. It's clear that Turkey is concerned by it, and it is a friction point, over natural resources and their exploitation. Will it be short lived? I would say I don't know. Much depends on how all of these parties, and again, it is not just an Egypt-Turkey issue. Obviously, there is the gas forum, but it brings in all of these regional parties with interests in the Eastern Mediterranean. I think the Eastern Med is probably the most important forum in which the grievances with Turkey will be litigated effectively, again, the trajectory of where this goes, I think, depends a lot on how these parties approach the issue, and the broader issues that are separating all of these countries. You look at Turkey-Israel relations, Turkey-Egypt relations, which we've been talking about extensively. Turkey has tensions with a number of regional parties. From the Davutoglu days of zero problems. Now almost Turkey has well, not zero friends, but a reduced number of regional friends, and that has to be of concern. And it's not enough to say that that the gas forum is in its infancy and is not going to amount to anything. I don't think there's any basis to say that. Obviously, there are real hurdles in front of the gas forum, but clearly it's also something that has caught Turkey's attention. It is arrayed against it and its interests, and Turkey, I think, realizes that and sees that now that it has an interest in reducing tensions. I think some in Egypt and in the region more broadly wonder if this is simply an effort by Turkey to fracture those ties that have grown up over time. Whether Turkey is simply trying to be a spoiler and trying to divide these countries at a time when they are coming together. That's clearly a viewpoint of some in Egypt. And we will see, in terms of next steps. But for those who have taken hardline positions against Turkey in Cairo, that is a suspicion about what Turkey is up to now.
Sure. There is obviously one development between Turkish and American relationship in the last couple of years that really made things very difficult, which is the Turkish purchase of S-400s from Russia. It is even today on Friday, U.S. ambassador in Ankara is giving another statement over it. At the same time, Egypt has been buying Russian arms. And most prominently, perhaps, this is Su-35 fighter jets. Do you see any Russian factor in terms of the Turkish president and Egyptian president's maybe aspirations for better relationship?
I think Russia figures into the United States' view of the region and the Mediterranean. Obviously Russia has been involved in Libya, and they want to, create a role for themselves in Libya and the Eastern Mediterranean. That is something that is of concern to the United States as well. I don't think, Turkey and Egypt both have had growing relations with Russia in recent years. And, you raise the issue of sanctions and the possibility that might be something that is coming down the road for Egypt. I think it is definitely going to be a source of discussion it will be an issue for discussion in Congress. If sanctions are possible for a NATO ally like Turkey, clearly, Egypt shouldn't feel that it can act with complete impunity. So I think, it's a separate, it's somewhat divergent issue in relation to the strains in U.S.-Egypt relations. But that's clearly something that is on the agenda, not very high up on the agenda, but clearly U.S.-Egypt relations are not in a good place. So again, Russia has become a growing factor in the region, and I think it's part of these discussions. I don't think it is the main driver of these discussions, however.
Okay, let me ask my final question, and this is kind of a broad question, and you can also add anything you'd like to add about the current relationship that we have not touched. So one of the leaked conditions, I think this has never been put forward officially, but through some channels, that Turkey needs to withdraw their troops or proxies from Libya, as well as Syria and Iraq, to be able to go forward with Egypt. Each of these countries, can you briefly explain to us what is Egyptian concerns over these countries? I don't even know whether there are still problems with regards to Syria or Iraq, but if you can tell us in this three countries, Egyptian-Turkish relations?
Yeah, I think the most urgent issues for Egypt, they have subsided somewhat in Libya, but I think, Libya and the Brotherhood, those are the kind of the two most urgent issues, and we've seen the most far-reaching and concrete Egyptian demands in that respect. Um, I would take these as opening bids. I don't know that Egypt imagines that it's going to get everything it wants, but it is laying out, its all of its maximalist vision of what it wants from Turkey.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that that's absolutely necessary for fulfillment of all of those conditions for an improvement in relations, because frankly, some of them I think are beyond the capacity or willingness of Turkey to fulfill. I think Egyptian alarm about the direct Turkish military intervention in Libya was such that they threatened their own direct military intervention. If the offensive continued eastward, obviously it didn't, and Libya is in a very different position now. Egypt has engaged with the new government there, and so tensions have reduced in Libya for the moment. I don't know if this will sustain itself, but for the moment, we don't see the kinds of alarm that existed in Cairo when there was real fear that the Turkish-backed offensive was going to go all the way to the east. Just a side note, Egypt was always wary and did not want Haftar to and his forces to try to take Tripoli. It was something that they warned against. They went along with once it began. But all that to say, there is a scenario in which Egypt and Turkey could effectively come to a kind of agreement about how to operate in Libya. And that's something I could see being worked out in pragmatic terms. Particularly if Eastern forces are integrated in the armed forces, if there are guarantees about these Turkish-backed forces not trying to take over the east. So I think that can be worked out. Similarly, with the Brotherhood and the opposition, Egypt has laid out pretty far-reaching demands about turning over opposition figures to Egypt. I know yesterday some Turkish officials were quick to say that they have no plans to turn over opposition figures, and they downplayed what had happened between them and the opposition channels. But clearly something had happened in terms of instructions about reducing these channels' criticism of Egypt and Sisi. And again, I think some kind of modus operandi could be instituted that falls short of what Egypt has publicly demanded of Turkey. I think how this will impact these opposition channels in the coming weeks and months will be something that Egypt is going to keep a close watch on. And again, one could imagine a kind of growing relationship on the basis of understandings that fall short of the very far-reaching demands that Egypt has put forward to date. But again, as we started this discussion, we're in the early stages of these moves, and I think it's possible that something more pragmatic and sustainable emerges, but that will depend on the goodwill and trust and between these two very skeptical and suspicious parties.
I understand. And when you are talking about Muslim Brotherhood, there is also Hamas factor, Erdogan's close relationship with Hamas leaders, whereas Egyptian, that would be any kind of condition there, or am I taking too much?
Yeah, I don't know that it would be an Egyptian condition. Egypt
Mm-hmm.
has become much more much more pragmatic on Palestinian politics. In 2014 and 15, the Sisi regime's regional policy was really a kind of outgrowth and extension of his domestic policy, and was highly ideological. Looking at the Muslim Brotherhood and its affiliates throughout the region was a kind of proxy for how Egypt thought about each and every issue. Egypt's view on Palestinian politics has, I think, evolved over time. It does look more pragmatic, and Egypt shares the border with Gaza, and so ideology is maybe not the best and most effective prism through which Egypt can engage in its relations with the Palestinians and Hamas, and I think they've moved from that. So, I don't think that that's going to be central to Egypt's calculations with respect to Turkey.
Okay, thank you so much, Michael Hanna, a senior fellow at the Century Foundation in New York. Thanks for coming on today. That was a very insightful and very helpful podcast that will help our listeners to understand the dynamics of the relationship between Cairo and Ankara. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
You can follow Ahval News Online podcast series through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, and Spreaker. All you need to know about Turkey is here, for your ears, mind, and attention. Thank you for listening to our podcast.